So can you explain kind of in short the concept you discussed of post-neutralism and what it means kind of in today's global system?
Well, I just offered the concept of post-neutralism as food for thought, actually. What we clearly see is this gap in knowledge, which does not really account for some instances of countries' behavior. For example, I gave the example of Belarus, where you have an allied country which demonstrates increasing neutrally leading behavior, but existing concepts do not really grasp that. How can you be neutrally allied and have those commitments, bilateral and multilateral commitments, but at the same time behave on an increasing basis in a way which is expected from neutral states? So this gap sort of poses a question: how can we explain for that? What kind of concepts can be there? And that's why I thought that some kind of post-neutralism ideas might be helpful, because if we track the evolution of other ideas within this whole discussion about neutrality, we had traditional neutrality, we had neutralism, which was to explain why states which are not parts of military blocs still behave in a way which is not really expected from traditional neutrals. So I thought the next logical step might be this. But again, this is just food for thought, and we still need to work on that quite a lot.
Okay, all right, excellent. And then can you stress on maybe kind of what are the pros and cons of this concept of post-neutralism, and kind of what are the reasons that you discussed also in your presentation of why states might be moving in this direction and using post-neutralism, especially in the concept of hedging you discussed, like what kind of the advantages or disadvantages of this hedging?
I think it's not even so much about advantages and disadvantages, but rather about structural pressures which make states behave in this kind of way. And that's why I also talked about two smaller ideas. The first one of situational neutrality, and this is something we've observed in the case of Belarus, but also a few other states, again, which are allied, but due to some specific security pressures, they have to become sort of situationally neutral to make sure that even though they have those commitments within an alliance, they will not become the primary victims of a bigger powers confrontation. And again, this is quite a typical situation in the history of international relations. So I think if we'll look back at history, we'll also find some examples like that. So this is primarily this need to provide for your own security, even though there is a bigger legal or political framework. But then, and again, I talked about Belarus, over a couple of years we see that this leaning towards situational neutrality leads to some additional thinking. So there is an ideational dimension to this behavior, which is already more about some project thinking, where countries like Belarus start initiating some projects which should help them to stay, well, not necessarily neutral, but safe. But at the same time, those ideas are about some kind of neutral ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. And then last question, how might this concept of a kind of a new approach towards neutrality, how might it change kind of the classical interpretation of neutrality? Do you think it might like kind of harm or boost or enhance or just expand kind of the meaning of what neutrality means for other states around the world today?
Well, I think, whenever we deal with such theories, we always face this problem: how do we stay within some more clearly delineated sort of contours, which will make sure that the concept works precisely and there is no this problem of conceptual emptiness. But as we can know from the theory of international relations, it's very difficult. Like, take some of the big concepts there, some big ideas like realism, for example. I mean, you have this huge variety of different concepts about realism, and then in the end, even the students of international relations got lost. So what exactly is meant by this concept? So I think, of course, in a way, this is something which might happen to concepts like neutrality, and this is in a way inevitable. But then, of course, the question in the end is whether some new build-ups on the original ideas can be helpful in explaining things, and I talked about that, whether they can somehow fill the gap or not. If they do, then it's still worth trying, in my view.